A poor black boy gave his only warm jacket to a homeless man. When a luxury car stopped at his house days later, his mother's tears revealed a truth nobody expected. Marcus pulled his navy blue jacket tighter around his shoulders as the cold morning air bit at his face. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the street lights still cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk. He checked his watch, 6:45 a.m., right on schedule. His footsteps echoed against the brick buildings as he made his way down Wilson Street, the same route he'd taken to school every day for the past 3 years. The jacket's zipper caught slightly as he pulled it up to his chin. His mother had shown him how to fix that with a little soap, but he hadn't gotten around to it yet. "Morning, Mrs. Chun," he called out as he passed the corner store. The old woman was already setting up her fruit stand, arranging apples in neat rows. "Marcus, you're early today." She waved, her breath visible in the cold air. "Tell your mama those sweet potato pies she made last week were perfect. Sold every single one." "Yes, ma'am, I will." Marcus smiled, thinking about how his mother would beam at the news. They needed the extra money from those pies, especially now that winter was coming. The smell of fresh bread from Joe's bakery made his stomach growl. He hadn't eaten breakfast. There hadn't been time after helping his mother package the morning's batch of pies for delivery. His hand brushed against the single dollar in his pocket. Lunch money. He couldn't spend it on breakfast, no matter how hungry he felt. The street began to fill with more people as he approached the business district. Men and women in suits rushed past him, clutching coffee cups and talking into phones. Their shoes clicked against the pavement, expensive shoes that never seemed to get scuffed. That's when he first saw him. An elderly man sat against the red brick wall between the coffee shop and the bank, his thin jacket pulled tight around his frame. His eyes were fixed on some distant point, and he didn't reach out or ask for anything as people passed. He just sat there, shoulders hunched against the cold. Marcus slowed his pace. The man's hands were red from the cold, and his jacket had holes in the elbows. A paper cup sat empty beside him, but he wasn't holding it out to people walking by. A black SUV pulled up to the curb nearby, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out. He walked past the elderly man without a glance, his phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, I'll have those reports on your desk by noon." "No, that won't be a problem." Marcus watched as the businessman disappeared into the bank. The elderly man's eyes followed him too, but there was no bitterness in his gaze. Just that same distant look. The memory of his 10th birthday flooded back suddenly. His mother had saved for months to buy him this jacket. He remembered how she'd called him into the kitchen that morning, her eyes bright with excitement. "Close your eyes, baby," she'd said, and he'd felt the soft fabric being placed in his hands. When he opened them, there it was brand new, with the tag still on. Navy blue, just like he'd wanted. "It's not designer like some of your classmates have," she'd said, straightening the collar. "But it's warm, and it'll last." Marcus had hugged her so tight she laughed. "It's perfect, Mom. Thank you." Now, standing on the cold street, Marcus watched as the elderly man suppressed a shiver. Without thinking, he took a step closer. "Good morning, sir," he said softly. The man looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered face. "Morning, young man." His voice was rough but gentle. Are you staying warm enough?" Marcus asked, immediately feeling foolish. Obviously, the man wasn't warm enough. A small smile crossed the elderly man's face. "I manage." He nodded at Marcus's jacket. "You got yourself a good coat there. Your mama picked that out." Marcus nodded, throat tight. "She did good. Better get on to school now. Don't want to be late." Marcus hesitated, then nodded again. "Yes, sir. Have a good day." He walked on, but the image of the man's red hands stayed with him. In his classroom, Marcus barely heard Ms. Thompson's lesson about fractions. His mind kept drifting back to the brick wall and the man who sat there so quietly. When the final bell rang, Marcus packed his books slowly. He'd have to pass that spot again on his way home. The temperature had dropped even further. He could see it in the frost forming on the classroom windows. The businessman's black SUV was still parked outside the bank when Marcus walked past. The elderly man remained in his spot, but now he was visibly shaking. As Marcus watched, he tucked his hands under his arms, trying to generate some warmth. That night, Marcus lay in bed, staring at his jacket hanging on the door hook. His mother's voice drifted from the kitchen where she was preparing the next day's pies. Sometimes, she always said, all someone needs is an act of kindness. He pulled the blanket up to his chin, but sleep wouldn't come. Outside, the wind howled through the streets, and all he could think about was an old man sitting against a cold brick wall, watching the world rush by. Marcus rolled over, trying to get comfortable, but the image wouldn't leave him. He remembered how his father had left them, just walked out one day and never came back. No explanation, no goodbye, just an empty space where he used to be. The elderly man's eyes had held that same kind of emptiness. Finally, Marcus drifted off to sleep, his dreams filled with red brick walls and distant gazes, while his navy blue jacket cast a long shadow in the moonlight streaming through his window. The next morning felt colder than the last. Marcus woke before his alarm, the sound of his mother's pots clanking in the kitchen already filling their small apartment. Steam fogged the bedroom window, and he could see frost crystallizing at the corners. "Marcus, don't forget to pack your math homework." His mother's voice carried through the thin walls. "Got it, Mom?" He stuffed the completed worksheets into his backpack, grabbed his jacket, and headed to the kitchen. Their kitchen was warm from baking, the counter covered in cooling sweet potato pies. His mother stood at the sink, washing dishes, her hair tied back with a faded bandana. She turned and gave him a tired smile. "I made you a sandwich for lunch today," she said, nodding toward the paper bag on the counter. "Had a good day at the bakery yesterday." Mr. Thompson ordered extra pies. Marcus hugged her from behind. "Thanks, Mom. Need help with anything before I go?" She dried her hands on her apron. "No, baby. Just stay warm out there. They're saying it might snow next week." The mention of cold made Marcus think of the elderly man. He grabbed his jacket, then paused. "Mom, can I ask you something? Always, if someone needs help, but you don't have much yourself, should you still try to help them?" His mother turned fully toward him, studying his face. "What's on your mind?" "There's this man who sits between the coffee shop and the bank. He doesn't ask for anything, but—" Marcus trailed off. "But he needs help," she finished softly. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment, wiping her hands slowly on her apron. "You know, when your father left, we had nothing. But Mrs. Chun from the corner store? She gave us credit for groceries until I got back on my feet. Mr. Thompson let me use his kitchen after hours to start my pie business." She touched Marcus's cheek. "Sometimes the people with the least give the most because they know what it means to need help." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. "Just be careful," she added. "And remember, you can't help everyone." The walk to school felt longer than usual. When Marcus reached the business district, he saw the elderly man was already in his usual spot. Today he had a newspaper spread across his lap, though his hands shook too much to hold it steady. The black SUV pulled up right on schedule. The businessman stepped out, this time carrying a steaming cup of coffee. The rich aroma drifted across the sidewalk as he passed. The elderly man's eyes followed the cup, then returned to his shaking newspaper. Marcus stopped. "Would you like a sandwich, sir?" The man looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes. "You're the young man from yesterday." "Yes, sir. My mom made it. It's turkey." The man shook his head. "Keep your lunch, son. You'll need it." "I'm not that hungry," Marcus lied, his stomach growling softly. "Please?" After a long moment, the man accepted the sandwich with trembling hands. "Thank you." He carefully unwrapped it, taking a small bite. "Your mama made this?" "Yes, sir. She makes the best sandwiches. And pies, too." "What's your name, son?" "Marcus." "Marcus," the man repeated softly. "I'm James. Former Sergeant James Wilson, though that was a long time ago. A veteran." Marcus remembered his mother's words about people who needed help. "Thank you for your service, sir." James's eyes grew distant. "Long time ago," he repeated. "Different life." The businessman emerged from the bank, phone to his ear again. He paused briefly, watching Marcus and James, then made a note on his phone before getting into his SUV. "You better get to school," James said. "Don't want to be late on my account." Throughout the school day, Marcus found himself thinking about James. During lunch, his stomach grumbled, but the memory of James carefully eating that sandwich made the hunger easier to bear. After school, Marcus stopped at Mrs. Chen's store. She was restocking shelves, her cart full of canned goods. Mrs. Chen, do you know anything about the man who sits by the bank? She paused, a can of soup in her hand. James? Yes, he's been there about 6 months now. Used to have a family. I hear. Something happened. Nobody knows what exactly. War changes people, they say. He fought in a war? Vietnam, I think. He doesn't talk much about it. But sometimes, early in the morning, I see him stand at attention when they raise the flag at the bank. She put the can on the shelf. Why do you ask? Just wondering, Marcus said. But he lingered. Mrs. Chun? What happens to people like him when it snows? She sighed. Some find shelters. Some don't make it through winter. Cities got programs, but... She shrugged. Papers to fill out. Places to go. Some veterans, they can't handle that. Too much noise. Too many people. That night, Marcus helped his mother package pies for delivery. The kitchen radio crackled with the weather report. Temperature expected to drop into the low 20s tonight. First snowfall of the season possible by next week. His mother noticed his distraction. Still thinking about that man? James, Marcus said. His name is James. He's a veteran. She nodded, crimping the edge of a pie crust. Veterans have it hard sometimes. Your grandfather, my daddy, he was never the same after his war. What happened to him? Some hurts you can't see, baby. Some wounds don't heal right. She wiped her hands on her apron. Just like some kinds of love don't heal right either. Marcus knew she was thinking about his father. He watched her hands move automatically, crimping and folding, creating perfect patterns in the dough. The same hands that had saved for months to buy him his jacket. That night, the temperature plummeted. Wind rattled the windows of their apartment. Marcus lay awake, thinking about James sitting against that brick wall, about his trembling hands and the careful way he'd eaten that sandwich. About the businessman in the SUV, making notes on his phone. His jacket hung on its hook, a dark shape in the dim room. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the people with the least give the most. Outside, the wind grew stronger, and somewhere in the city, an old soldier sat alone in the dark, waiting for another cold dawn. The morning air felt like ice in Marcus's lungs. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees overnight. He'd checked the thermometer outside their kitchen window. His breath came out in thick white clouds as he walked, the navy blue jacket pulled tight around him. The streets were unusually quiet. Even the early morning delivery trucks seemed muffled by the cold. Marcus's footsteps crunched on the thin layer of frost coating the sidewalk. As he approached the business district, his stomach knotted. He'd barely slept, thinking about what he was about to do. His mother's voice echoed in his head. That jacket needs to last all winter, Marcus. James was already in his spot, but something was different. The old veteran wasn't just sitting. He was shaking violently. His thin jacket offered no protection against the brutal cold. His hands, red and swollen, clutched at the fabric uselessly. Marcus stopped, watched. The old man's teeth chattered audibly in the quiet morning air. The familiar sound of an expensive engine broke the silence. The black SUV pulled up to its usual spot. The businessman stepped out, adjusted his wool coat, and reached back into the car for his coffee. Steam rose from the cup, dissipating in the frigid air. As the man walked past James, he slowed slightly. His free hand moved to his pocket, then stopped. He continued into the bank, but this time he pulled out his phone before he reached the door, typing something with his thumb. Marcus stood rooted to the spot, his own hands warm in the jacket pockets. He thought about his father. The day he left, the sound of the door closing. No goodbye, no explanation. Just gone, leaving Marcus and his mother to face the world alone. He thought about his mother's hands, working late into the night, making pies to sell. The proud smile on her face when she'd given him this jacket. It's not designer, she'd said, but it'll keep you warm. James's violent shivering cut through Marcus's thoughts. Before he could change his mind, Marcus walked over to the brick wall. James looked up, his face tight with cold. Morning, Marcus, he managed through chattering teeth. Marcus's fingers found the zipper of his jacket. Mr. James, I want you to have this. The old veteran's eyes widened. No, son. That's your coat. Marcus was already sliding it off his shoulders. The cold hit him immediately, cutting through his thin school uniform. "Please, you need it more than me? I can't take your coat, boy. Your mama bought you that coat. She taught me to help people who need it." Marcus held out the jacket, his arm trembling slightly. From cold or nerves, he wasn't sure. James shook his head. "Marcus, you'll freeze." "I have others at home," Marcus lied. His white school shirt offered no protection against the cold, but he kept his arm extended, holding out the jacket. Through the bank's glass doors, the businessman watched, phone in hand, fingers moving across the screen. James looked at the jacket, then at Marcus's face. Something changed in the old soldier's eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of the kind of determination that wouldn't be denied. With shaking hands, James reached for the jacket. "Your mama raised you right," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Marcus helped James put it on, the veteran's stiff fingers struggling with the zipper. When it was done, James sat straighter, the navy blue fabric a stark contrast against the red brick wall. "Thank you, son," James whispered. "Thank you." Marcus nodded, unable to speak. The cold was already seeping into his bones, but something warm spread through his chest as he watched James stop shivering. The businessman emerged from the bank. He stood at the top of the steps for a moment, looking at Marcus in his thin white shirt, then at James in the navy blue jacket. His fingers moved across his phone screen one more time before he got into his SUV and drove away. Marcus walked to school, his arms wrapped around himself. By the time he reached his classroom, he couldn't feel his fingers. "MS." Thompson frowned when she saw him. "Marcus, where's your jacket?" I forgot it," he said, sliding into his seat. Some of his classmates snickered. "Did you really give it to that homeless guy?" Tommy whispered from behind him. "I saw you." "Man, that's stupid. It's supposed to snow next week." Marcus stared straight ahead, focusing on the math problems on the board. The numbers blurred as he shivered. During lunch, he sat alone, still cold despite being indoors. He thought about James, wondering if the jacket was keeping him warm enough, wondering what his mother would say when she found out. The afternoon dragged. Every time Marcus looked out the window, he expected to see snow. The gray clouds hung low and heavy, promising worse weather to come. After the final bell, Marcus walked home slowly. His muscles ached from shivering all day. As he passed the brick wall, he saw that James was gone, but a folded piece of paper sat in his usual spot. Marcus picked it up with numb fingers. In shaky handwriting, it read, "Thank you, young soldier, for fighting a different kind of war." At home, Marcus hung his backpack on the hook where his jacket used to be. His mother was still at work, delivering pies. He had maybe an hour before she'd notice. He sat on his bed, looking at the empty hook. The room felt colder somehow. Outside, the first few snowflakes began to fall, drifting past his window like tiny white feathers. His father had walked away, leaving them with nothing. But Marcus had walked toward someone who needed help, giving away the warmest thing he owned. Maybe that made some kind of difference in the world. Maybe that's what his mother meant about acts of kindness. The sound of keys in the front door made his heart jump. His mother was home early. "Marcus," she called. "Baby, it's starting to snow. Make sure you wear your—" Her voice trailed off as she appeared in his doorway, eyes fixed on the empty hook. The snowflakes fell harder outside, coating the world in white, while inside, Marcus prepared to explain to his mother why sometimes the hardest choices are also the right ones. The next morning hit Marcus like a slap of cold air. Without his jacket, the walk to school felt twice as long. He put on 2 shirts under his uniform, but the wind cut right through them. His mother hadn't yelled when he told her about the jacket. She hadn't said much at all, really. Just stood there, looking at the empty hook, then pulled him into a tight hug that lasted a long time. "You're so much like your grandfather," she'd whispered into his hair. "Always fighting other people's battles." Now, hurrying down the frost-covered sidewalk, Marcus wondered if James would be in his usual spot. The brick wall stood empty when he passed. The navy blue jacket was nowhere in sight. "Hey, jacket boy." Marcus turned to see Tommy and a group of his friends approaching from the opposite direction. "Man, I told everyone at school what you did," Tommy said, falling in a step beside him. You really gave your jacket to that homeless dude? His name is James, Marcus said through chattering teeth. And he's a veteran. Still stupid, Tommy replied. It's going to snow for real today. What are you going to do then? Marcus kept walking, trying to ignore how his fingers had gone numb. I'll be fine. Yo, guys. Tommy called to their classmates. Check it out. We got ourselves a real hero here. Trading his jacket for good karma. The laughter stung worse than the cold. In class, Marcus couldn't stop shivering. Ms. Thompson noticed, of course. She kept the classroom extra warm and gave him concerned looks throughout the morning. During lunch break, she called him to her desk. Marcus, where's your jacket? Her voice was gentle but worried. I gave it to someone who needed it more. She studied his face. That's very kind, but you need to stay warm too. I have an old sweater in my classroom closet dash. No thank you, Ms. Thompson. I'm okay. But he wasn't okay. By afternoon, his teeth wouldn't stop chattering. His head felt heavy and hot, despite the cold. When the final bell rang, he could barely focus on packing his books. The walk home was torture. Snow had started falling, real snow this time, not just flurries. The black SUV was parked in its usual spot, but the businessman wasn't around. The brick wall stood empty, no sign of James. Marcus's chest felt tight. Each breath burned. By the time he reached their apartment, he could barely climb the stairs. His mother took one look at him and pressed her hand to his forehead. Baby, you're burning up. I'm fine, he tried to say, but started coughing instead. She helped him into bed, piling on every blanket they owned. I'm calling in sick to work tomorrow. You're not going anywhere with this fever. But Mom, your delivery's dash. Hush now. Some things are more important than pies. That night, Marcus drifted in and out of fever dreams. He saw James in a navy blue jacket, standing at attention before a flag. Saw his father walking away down an endless street. Saw the businessman in his SUV, endlessly typing on his phone. Morning came with more snow and a higher fever. His mother called the school, then sat beside his bed, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. I'm sorry, Marcus mumbled. About the jacket. Don't be sorry for having a good heart. She adjusted the blankets. But maybe next time we can find a way to help that doesn't make you sick. A knock at their door made them both jump. Marcus heard his mother's footsteps, then voices in the hallway. Yes, he lives here. No, he's sick today. What do you mean you've been watching? Marcus tried to sit up, but the room spun. Through his fever haze, he heard more voices joining the first. The words floated to him in fragments. Concerned citizens noticed the boy's actions. Community meeting. His mother's voice rose slightly. My son did what he thought was right. Now if you'll excuse me, he needs rest. The door closed firmly. His mother returned, her face troubled. What's wrong? Marcus asked. Nothing, baby. Just some neighbors talking. But she kept glancing at the door. Throughout the day, more people knocked. Mrs. Chun brought soup. Mr. Thompson from the bakery left a bag of fresh rolls. Even Ms. Thompson stopped by after school with a stack of homework and a worried frown. The other students miss you, she told him. Even Tommy asked if you were okay. Marcus dozed fitfully. Every time he woke, he looked for the navy blue jacket on its hook, then remembered. His mother kept the radio on low, and weather reports drifted through his fever. Worst winter storm in a decade. Temperatures expected to drop further. Emergency shelters opening across the city. In his more lucid moments, Marcus worried about James. Had the jacket been enough? Was he somewhere warm? The businessman's face kept appearing in his thoughts. Always watching, always typing on his phone. On the third day of his fever, Marcus woke to the sound of a car door closing outside their building. Through his window, he caught a glimpse of black paint gleaming in the snow. His mother's voice carried from the living room. I don't care who you are. My son is sick. Whatever this is about can wait. Ma'am, a man's voice replied. I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. It's about the jacket. And James. Marcus tried to call out, to ask who was there, but his voice came out as a weak croak. Outside, the snow continued to fall, coating the black SUV in a layer of white. Marcus strained to hear the conversation from the living room, but his fever made everything sound distant and muffled. He caught fragments of the businessman's voice deeper and softer than it had been on his phone calls. Been watching your son's interactions with James. Didn't understand at first. The jacket was what finally. His mother's voice was guarded. Why have you been watching my son? Because James Wilson is my father. The silence that followed was heavy. Marcus pushed himself up on his elbows, fighting the dizziness. Your father? His mother's voice had changed. You're telling me you've watched your own father sitting on that street for months? It's complicated. The businessman's voice cracked slightly. We haven't spoken in 15 years. After he came back from Vietnam, after my mother died, he just disappeared. Marcus's bedroom door creaked open. His mother stood there, concern etched on her face. Behind her was the businessman, but he looked different now, smaller somehow, without his usual confident stance. His expensive coat was dusted with snow. Marcus, are you up for a visitor? Marcus nodded weakly. The businessman stepped into the room, looking uncomfortable. Hello, Marcus. I'm Michael Wilson. He cleared his throat. I've been watching you talk to my father. Is James okay? Marcus's voice was hoarse. Michael's face softened. Yes, thanks to you. Actually, he sat in the chair beside Marcus's bed. I've been trying to find a way to approach him for months. Every day, I'd park outside that bank, telling myself today would be the day I'd talk to him. But I couldn't. I couldn't face him. Why not? Marcus asked. Michael stared at his hands. The last time we spoke, I told him I was ashamed of him. He'd been living on the streets on and off, refusing help, saying he didn't deserve a normal life after what he'd seen in the war. He looked up at Marcus. I was young, angry. I didn't understand what he was going through. Marcus's mother leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed. And now I watch a 10-year-old boy show more courage and compassion than I've managed in 15 years. Michael's voice was bitter. Every day, I'd make notes on my phone, observations about my father's condition, ideas for approaching him. But I never did anything. Then I saw Marcus give him his only jacket. A coughing fit interrupted Marcus's attempt to respond. His mother was immediately beside him, helping him sit up, pressing a glass of water to his lips. Where is he now? Marcus asked when he could speak again. James? At the veterans' shelter on Oak Street. Michael ran a hand through his hair. Your jacket. It gave me an opening. When I saw him wearing it, I finally had something to say to him. Nice jacket, I said. He told me about you. About your kindness. He paused. We talked for hours. The shelter's good, Marcus's mother said. They have doctors there. Michael nodded. He's getting help. Real help, finally. And he hesitated. He asked about you, Marcus. When he heard you were sick, a knock at their front door interrupted him. Marcus's mother went to answer it, returning with Mrs. Chun, who carried a large paper bag. Brought more soup, Mrs. Chun announced, then stopped short at the sight of Michael. Her eyes narrowed. You're the man from the black car? Yes, ma'am. Michael stood. I'm James's son. Mrs. Chun set the bag down hard on Marcus's dresser. All these months, I watch you watch your father freeze. What kind of son dash, Mrs. Chun? Marcus's mother cut in quietly. He's trying to make it right. The room fell silent except for Marcus's ragged breathing. Outside, car horns honked as traffic crawled through the snowfall. The whole neighborhood's talking, Mrs. Chun said finally, about the boy who gave away his jacket. Some say he's foolish. Some say he's a saint. She looked at Marcus. Me? I say he's what we all should be. Michael pulled something from his coat pocket, a folded piece of paper. Marcus, my father wanted you to have this. He handed it to Marcus's mother, who unfolded it carefully. It was a pencil drawing, skilled, detailed, of Marcus offering the jacket. At the bottom, in the same shaky handwriting as the thank you note, were the words, "The bravest soldier I ever met." Marcus's vision blurred, and not just from the fever. There's more, Michael said. The Veterans Organization, when they heard about what happened, they want to do something for both of you. He looked at Marcus's mother. They're calling it the Jacket Initiative, a program to help veterans reconnect with their families, inspired by your son's act of kindness. Marcus's mother sat on the edge of his bed, the drawing trembling in her hands. And Marcus, Michael continued, my father, he wants his jacket back. Marcus blinked in confusion. Not your jacket, Michael clarified quickly. His old service jacket. He asked me to get it from storage. Said maybe you'd like to have it. Once it's cleaned and repaired. Another knock at the door made everyone jump. This time it was Tommy from school, red-faced from the cold. Hey, he shuffled his feet. The class, we took up a collection. He thrust out a paper bag. For a new jacket. For Marcus. Marcus's mother took the bag, her eyes glistening. Tell them thank you, she said softly. Tommy nodded, then blurted out. I was wrong, Marcus. About what I said. About it being stupid. It wasn't stupid at all. The snow fell harder outside, but Marcus's room had never felt warmer. As Michael and Mrs. Chin talked quietly with his mother, as Tommy awkwardly patted his foot through the blanket before leaving, Marcus thought about James and his navy blue jacket, finally talking to his son. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness created the biggest ripples. Sometimes all it took was a jacket to bridge the gaps between people's hearts. 3 days later, the biggest winter storm in a decade hit the city. Marcus watched from his window as snow piled up in drifts against buildings and cars disappeared under white blankets. His fever had finally broken, but his mother insisted he stay home one more day. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts. All schools closed. Emergency shelters at capacity. Residents advised to stay indoors. His mother paced the small apartment, talking on the phone. Yes, Mr. Thompson, I understand about the pie deliveries. No, of course, safety first. Yes, I'll call when the roads are clear. Marcus's eyes kept drifting to the brick wall, barely visible through the swirling snow. The spot where James used to sit was now buried under 3 feet of white. The navy blue jacket hung on its hook again. Michael had brought it back yesterday, cleaned and repaired. Dad wants you to keep it, he'd said. Says it belongs to someone who knows how to use it right. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows. The power flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Marcus! His mother called from the kitchen. Stay in bed. I'll find the candles. But something caught his attention through the snow, a familiar black shape pulling up to the curb outside their building. The SUV's headlights cut through the storm like searchlights. Marcus's door burst open. Michael stood there, snow melting on his expensive coat, his face tight with worry. He's gone, he said without preamble. Dad's gone? Marcus's mother appeared behind him with a flashlight. What do you mean gone? He walked out of the shelter this morning. Said he needed air. When the storm hit, Michael's voice cracked. They can't find him. Marcus was already pulling on the navy blue jacket. No, his mother said firmly. You just got over that fever. You're not going out in this storm. Mom? Marcus met her eyes in the beam of the flashlight. Please. She looked at him for a long moment, then at the jacket, then back at his face. Michael, your SUV have 4-wheel drive? Yes, ma'am. Good. Because if we're doing this, we're doing it right. 10 minutes later, they were inching through snow-covered streets in Michael's heated SUV. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the falling snow. He used to do this in Vietnam, Michael said quietly, peering through the whiteout conditions. Just walk away. Disappear for hours. Mom used to say he was patrolling, even years after he came home. They checked the brick wall first, but found only snow. The coffee shop was closed, its windows dark. The bank's flag hung limp and ice-covered above them. Where else? Marcus's mother asked from the back seat. Where would he go? Michael gripped the steering wheel tighter. I don't know. I've lost so much time. 15 years of not knowing him. The park, Marcus said suddenly. Mrs. Chun said she saw him there sometimes early in the morning. By the war memorial. The SUV's tires spun for a moment before finding grip. They turned toward the park, moving slowly through unplowed streets. The park was a white wilderness. Tree branches hung low under the weight of snow. The memorial, a simple stone wall with names, was barely visible through the storm. And there, standing at attention before it, was a figure in a thin jacket. Dad! Michael was out of the SUV before it fully stopped, plunging into knee-deep snow. James didn't move, didn't seem to hear. His eyes were fixed on the memorial, his hands stiff at his sides. Marcus watched through the window as Michael approached slowly, calling out again. Dad? It's Mickey. Remember how you used to call me Mickey? James blinked, turning slightly. Mickey? His voice was faint through the howling wind. Yeah, Dad. It's me. Let's get you warm. Okay. Can't leave them, James said. My unit. My responsibility. Michael stopped a few feet away. I know, Dad. I know about your unit. But they're not here now. They're on the wall, see? Their names are safe on the wall. James stared at his son, then back at the memorial. Safe? Safe, Michael confirmed. Like how Marcus kept you safe with his jacket. Remember Marcus? At the sound of his name, Marcus opened the SUV door. Snow swirled into the warm interior. Marcus? James turned toward the sound. Recognition flickered in his ice-pale face. The young soldier. Yes, sir. Marcus stepped carefully through the snow. We came to bring you home. Home, James repeated, as if testing the word. Please, Dad. Michael's voice broke. Please come home. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. James looked at his son, really looked at him for the first time. Mickey, he said again softer. You grew up? Yeah, Dad. I did. And I was wrong. About everything. Please let me make it right. The wind died for a moment, leaving them in a pocket of swirling snow. James reached out slowly, touched Michael's face with a trembling hand. My boy, he whispered. My Mickey. Then his legs gave out. Michael caught him before he hit the snow. Marcus and his mother were there instantly, helping support James's weight as they struggled back to the SUV. The heater blasted full power as they drove to the hospital. James huddled between Michael and Marcus in the back seat, his hands blue with cold. The jacket, he mumbled, touching the navy blue sleeve of Marcus's coat. Kept me warm. Reminded you of what, Dad? That people still care. Still. His voice faded as his eyes closed. The emergency room was chaos, full of storm victims and accidents. But when they heard homeless veteran, when they saw Michael's face and Marcus still in his navy blue jacket, something shifted. Doctors appeared. Forms were filled out quickly. James disappeared behind swinging doors on a gurney. They waited for hours. Marcus's mother made calls to Mrs. Chun, to Mr. Thompson, to the veterans' shelter. Michael paced. Marcus sat, watching the snow through the hospital windows, thinking about warm jackets and cold wars and the things that bring people home. Finally, a doctor emerged. He'll be okay, she said. Hypothermia, exhaustion, some frostbite. But he'll be okay. Michael sagged against the wall. Marcus's mother squeezed his shoulder. He's asking for both of you, the doctor continued, looking at Michael and Marcus. Something about soldiers having to stick together. As they walked toward James's room, Michael stopped. Marcus? Yes, sir? Thank you for teaching me what courage looks like. Marcus thought about that as they approached the hospital room door. About courage and jackets and the storms that bring families back together. The hospital room was warm and quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors. James lay propped up on white pillows, his weathered face less pale now, his hands wrapped in bandages to treat the frostbite. My soldiers, he said softly as Michael and Marcus entered. The ghost of a smile crossed his face. Michael pulled up 2 chairs beside the bed. Marcus sat down, still wearing the navy blue jacket. Outside the window, the storm continued to rage. Dad, Michael started, his voice rough. I need to tell you something. About why I stayed away so long. James's eyes fixed on his son's face. Mickey, no, please. Let me say this. Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees. When Mom died and you started having trouble, I was young and stupid. I thought if I just worked hard enough, made enough money, somehow I could fix everything. Marcus watched James's bandaged hands tighten on the blanket. But I couldn't fix it, Michael continued. And instead of accepting that, I got angry. At you, at the war, at everything. I said things, horrible things. You were hurting, James said quietly. So were you. And I left you alone with your pain. Michael's voice cracked. Every day for the past 6 months, I'd see you on that street. Every single day, I'd tell myself today would be the day I'd talk to you. But I was a coward. No, James and Marcus said simultaneously. Michael looked at Marcus in surprise. Being scared doesn't make you a coward, Marcus said, thinking about his father, about empty hooks and closed doors. It's what you do when you're scared that matters. James nodded slowly. Smart boy. He shifted in the bed, wincing slightly. Mickey, when I came back from Vietnam, I brought the war with me. And here, he tapped his temple. Your mother, she understood. She knew when to be quiet, when to talk, when to just be there. After she died, you felt lost, Michael finished. Lost, James agreed. The streets, they made sense. No walls closing in. No memories trapped in photo albums. Just space to breathe. A nurse entered, checked James's vitals, adjusted his bandages. When she left, the room felt different somehow, as if the truth, finally spoken, had changed the air itself. I watched you too, James said suddenly. In your fancy car, your expensive suits. So successful. So far from the little boy who used to fall asleep listening to my war stories. I remember those stories, Michael said softly. You made your unit sound like heroes. They were heroes. Every one of them. James's eyes drifted to the window. Sometimes on that street, I'd see them walking past. Young again, laughing whole. The doctors call them hallucinations. I call them visits. Marcus thought about Mrs. Chin's words. Some hurts you can't see. But then, James continued, this young soldier here. He looked at Marcus. He reminded me that not all battles are fought with guns. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is offer warmth to someone who's cold. Michael pulled something from his coat pocket. A folded photograph, worn at the edges. I've carried this for 15 years, he said, handing it to his father. James's bandaged fingers trembled as he unfolded it. It showed a younger version of himself in uniform, holding a small boy on his shoulders. Both were laughing. Your 6th birthday, James said. The last good day before Mom got sick, Michael finished. Dad, I want more good days. With you? A tear rolled down James's weathered cheek. I have a house, Michael continued. Too big for just me. 3 bedrooms, a garden. Mom would have loved the garden. Mickey, please, Dad, come home. Really home. We can take it slow. I have a good therapist. She specializes in veterans. The VA hospital has new treatments. Whatever you need. James stared at the photograph for a long moment. I'm not the same man I was. Neither am I, Michael said. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can figure out who we are now. Together. Marcus stood quietly, meaning to give them privacy, but James's voice stopped him. Stay, soldier, the old veteran said. You're part of this unit now. Marcus sat back down, warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the jacket. Tell me about the garden, James said to Michael. As Michael described the flower beds his mother would have loved, the vegetable patch he'd never had time to plant. Marcus watched father and son lean toward each other like plants seeking light. A sharp knock made them all jump. Marcus's mother stood in the doorway with Mrs. Chun, both carrying paper bags that smelled of hot food. Nobody should be in a hospital without a proper meal, Mrs. Chun announced, setting out containers of soup and fresh rolls. James's eyes widened at the sight of real food. Ma'am, you don't have to dash. Hush, Mrs. Chin said firmly. I've been watching you watch over our street for months. Now it's our turn to watch over you. As they shared the meal, more visitors arrived. Mr. Thompson with a fresh-baked pie. M.S. Thompson with a card signed by Marcus's entire class. Even Tommy appeared briefly, awkwardly offering a small American flag for the veteran. The storm outside began to ease, but the warmth in room 247 only grew. Stories flowed, James sharing cleaned-up versions of his war tales, Michael describing his first fumbling attempts at gardening, Marcus's mother telling about her pie business's humble beginnings. You know, James said during a lull, that jacket of yours, Marcus, it didn't just keep me warm. No. Marcus asked. No. It reminded me that even when the world seems coldest, there's still warmth to be found. Still hope. He looked at his son. Still family. Michael gripped his father's bandaged hand carefully. Still family, he repeated. Marcus watched them, thinking about his own father who'd walked away, and this father and son finding their way back to each other. Sometimes he realized The family you lose makes room for the family you find. Outside, the storm finally broke, and weak sunlight filtered through the hospital window, touching the photograph of a laughing father and son still resting on James's blanket. The veteran shelter on Oak Street was a brick building with high windows and a flag hanging limply in the windless cold. 3 days after the storm, Marcus stood outside it with Michael, both of them watching James pace nervously near the entrance. "You sure about this?" James asked for the third time. "The whole unit's waiting, Dad," Michael said gently. "They've been asking about you since they heard." Inside, a group of veterans from James's old unit had gathered after seeing the local news story about Marcus's jacket and the reunion it sparked. Some had traveled from other states, drawn by the chance to see their old sergeant again. Marcus adjusted his navy blue jacket, now officially his to keep after James insisted. The morning was cold but clear, the storm's aftermath visible only in the piles of plowed snow lining the streets. "I don't know if I can," James started. "You can," Marcus said simply. James looked at him, then nodded slowly. "Lead the way, soldier." The shelter's common room had been transformed. Tables held coffee and donuts. Walls displayed old unit photos, and in the center stood 5 men, gray-haired now, but standing straight, eyes fixed on the door. When James entered, the room went silent. Then Sarge, a tall man with a silver crew cut, stepped forward. His eyes were wet. "Rodriguez?" James whispered. "Yes, Sarge. It's me." And Johnson, and Peters, and Miller, and Thompson. Each man nodded as his name was called. They were older, softer around the middle, but something of their military bearing remained. "We thought." "After Nam?" Rodriguez's voice cracked. "We looked for you, Sarge. I didn't want to be found," James admitted. Couldn't face what happened to Martinez. To Wilson. The men nodded solemnly. Marcus saw Michael stiffen slightly at the names of fallen soldiers. "Wasn't your fault, Sarge," Johnson said firmly. "We all knew the risks. Martinez and Wilson knew." "Should have been me," James said softly. "I was their sergeant. Their protection was my responsibility. And you did protect us," Peters stepped forward. "Every day, every patrol. You got the rest of us home." James's hands trembled. Michael moved closer to his father, supporting him without touching him. "Show him," Rodriguez said. Miller pulled something from a bag, a folded piece of fabric. When he shook it out, Marcus recognized the unit flag, faded but intact. "Martinez's sister had it," Miller explained. "Been trying to get the unit together for a proper ceremony. Then we saw the news about the jacket, about you being here." James reached out, touched the flag with shaking fingers. "You kept it?" "Of course we kept it, Sarge. Some things you don't leave behind." Marcus watched as something shifted in James's face, as if pieces long scattered were finally falling back into place. "Mickey," James said softly. "Come meet your uncles." Michael stepped forward, and the veterans surrounded him, exclaiming over how much he'd grown, sharing stories about when he was just a baby visiting the base with his mother. "Remember how he used to salute everything?" Thompson laughed. "Dogs, trees, his own reflection. Got the form perfect, though," Rodriguez added. "Better than some of our recruits." The tension in the room dissolved into laughter and tears, stories flowing freely now. Marcus stood back, watching as James slowly relaxed, began to smile, even laughed at a joke about army food. Mrs. Chin arrived with hot food. Real food, she insisted, not army slop. Mr. Thompson brought pies. Marcus's mother came during her delivery break, bringing fresh coffee and her quiet strength. The veterans pulled up chairs, forming a circle that somehow included everyone: soldiers, family, friends. They shared stories of war and peace, loss and discovery. Marcus learned about Martinez's legendary card tricks, about Wilson's terrible singing voice, about the night James had carried Rodriguez 3 miles through enemy territory with a twisted ankle. "But the real hero," James said suddenly, gesturing to Marcus, "is this young man here." He reminded an old soldier what courage looks like. Marcus felt his face grow warm as the veterans turned to him. "Tell us about the jacket, son," Rodriguez encouraged. So Marcus told them about seeing James in the cold, about remembering his mother's words on kindness, about the decision that felt both hard and simple at the same time. "That's a field promotion right there," Johnson declared, standing. "Rodriguez, you still carry yours?" Rodriguez pulled something from his pocket, a set of sergeant's stripes, worn but polished. "We all kept pieces of our uniforms," he explained, "to remember. But maybe—" He looked at James. "Maybe some pieces are meant to be passed on." James nodded, understanding. He took the stripes, then turned to Marcus. "Attention," he said softly. Marcus stood automatically, something in James's voice commanding respect. "For courage under fire," James said, his voice stronger now. "For putting others before yourself. For showing an old soldier the way home." He pinned the stripes to Marcus's jacket. "Welcome to the unit, Sergeant Marcus." The veteran stood, saluting. Michael's eyes shone with tears. Marcus's mother pressed her hands to her mouth. "But sir," Marcus whispered, "I didn't do anything special. It was just a jacket." "No, son," Rodriguez said. "It was never just a jacket. It was hope. It was kindness. It was everything we fought for. Everything we still fight for," James added, looking at his son. The afternoon passed in a blur of stories and laughter. The veterans shared more memories. The good ones now, the ones about friendship and brotherhood and survival. They talked about Martinez's sister, about Wilson's kids in college, about the lives their fallen brothers had made possible. As the sun began to set, Rodriguez pulled out a camera. "One more for the wall?" They gathered together, veterans, family, friends. Marcus stood between James and Michael, the navy blue jacket pressed between them. "Ready?" Rodriguez set the timer. "And remember, some things you don't leave behind." The camera flashed, capturing the moment, not just of a picture being taken, but of a circle being completed, of wounds beginning to heal, of a unit remembering it was still whole, even with pieces missing. Later, as people began to leave, James pulled Marcus aside. "You know the thing about units?" he said quietly. "No, sir. They're forever. Even when you can't see them, they're there, having your back, keeping you warm." He touched the stripes on Marcus's jacket. "You understand?" Marcus thought about his father who'd walked away, and this room full of men who'd walked back. About the difference between leaving and being lost. About the ways people find their way home. "Yes, sir," he said. "I understand." Spring came early that year, melting the last remnants of the winter storm. Marcus walked his usual route to school, wearing his navy blue jacket despite the warmer weather. The sergeant's stripes caught the morning sun, polished weekly just as Rodriguez had taught him. The brick wall between the coffee shop and bank stood empty now, but it wasn't abandoned. A small plaque had been installed there, the Jacket Initiative, where small acts of kindness create big changes in honor of all who serve. Marcus touched the plaque as he passed, a morning ritual. The Veterans Organization had launched the program officially last month, inspired by his story. Already, dozens of families have been reunited with their veteran relatives through its outreach efforts. The black SUV was parked in its usual spot, but these days it brought different feelings. As Marcus watched, Michael emerged from the bank, phone against his ear. "Yes, Dad. I'll pick up your prescription." "No, the garden center doesn't open until 9. "Yes, I know which tomato plants you want." Michael waved as he saw Marcus, covering the phone. "Headed to the center later," he called out. Marcus nodded. The Veteran Center had become his after-school destination 3 days a week. He helped serve meals, listen to stories, learn the proper way to fold a flag from Rodriguez, who volunteered there now. The sound of hammering drew his attention across the street. Workers were renovating an old building, the future home of the Jacket Initiative's first permanent facility. James had helped design it, insisting on open spaces and gardens, places where memories could breathe. "Morning, Marcus." Mrs. Chun was setting up her fruit stand, her smile bright in the spring sunshine. Business was better than ever since she'd started hiring veterans to help with deliveries. "Mom's pie's ready?" she asked. "Fresh this morning," Marcus confirmed. His mother's business had expanded. She now supplied baked goods to the Veterans Center and several local shelters. Mr. Thompson had even given her access to his industrial kitchen during off hours. The school day passed quickly. Marcus's essay about the Jacket Initiative had won a citywide competition, and MS. Thompson had asked him to present it at an assembly next week. Even Tommy, who'd once mocked his decision, had asked to volunteer at the center. After school, Marcus headed to the Veterans Center. The main room was full of life. Veterans teaching chess to local kids, family members reconnecting over coffee, social workers helping with paperwork. James sat in his usual spot by the window, tending to a row of small plants started from seeds in Michael's garden. He looked up as Marcus entered, his face relaxed and present in a way it hadn't been that winter day on the street. "How are my soldiers doing?" he asked as Michael arrived with the promised tomato plants. Garden center was packed, Michael reported, setting down the flats. "Everyone's getting spring fever." They worked together, transplanting seedlings into larger pots. James's hands were steady now, his movements sure as he taught Marcus the proper depth for each plant. "Like most things worth doing," he said, patting soil around a tiny stem, "it takes patience and faith that something good will grow." Rodriguez arrived with fresh coffee and news about another successful family reunion through the initiative. Peter's nephew, he reported, found him living under a bridge in Seattle. He's home now, getting help. They all understood what getting help meant. The center provided more than just meals and shelter. There were counselors, support groups, medical care. A place where the invisible wounds of war could heal in their own time. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows as more people arrived. Marcus's mother came in with a delivery of pies, pausing to check on James's plants. Mrs. Chun followed with fresh fruit for the center's kitchen. Even Tommy showed up, awkward but eager to help serve dinner. "Full house today," Michael observed, watching the room fill with veterans and families. "Full circle," James corrected softly. He touched the sergeant's stripes on Marcus's jacket. From one act of kindness to all of this, Marcus thought about that first cold morning, about the simple decision that had seemed so small at the time. "I just wanted to help," he said. "That's all any of us can do," James replied. "Help when we can, where we can. The rest." He gestured at the busy room, the growing plants, the families reconnecting. The rest grows on its own. Later, as the sun set, they gathered for the center's nightly ceremony. James and Rodriguez lowered the flag together, their movements precise despite their age. The veterans present stood at attention. Michael and Marcus joined them, watching the colors being carefully folded. "Tomorrow," James announced to the room, "we're starting a new program, teaching local kids about service, about looking out for each other." He looked at Marcus. "Our young sergeant here will help lead it." Marcus felt the weight of the stripes on his jacket, the responsibility they represented, not just to a military unit now, but to a larger mission, helping others find their way home. That evening, walking back to their apartment, Marcus and his mother passed the brick wall. The plaque caught the last light of day, its message simple but profound. "You know what I think?" his mother said, stopping to read the words again. "I think sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices, like a boy deciding to give away his jacket." Marcus touched the sergeant's stripes, thinking about choices and changes, about gardens growing from tiny seeds, about the many ways people could be warm. At home, he hung the jacket on its hook, not empty now, but full of meaning. Through his window, he could see the lights of the Veterans Center glowing in the distance. Tomorrow, he'd wear the jacket again, ready for whatever new ways he might find to help. Because that's what soldiers do, James had taught him. They look out for their unit. They bring people home. They keep each other warm. And sometimes, in the simplest acts of kindness, they find their own way forward, one small choice at a time.